Okay, this is Foner's Chapter 23, The United States in the Cold War, 45 to 53, Part 1. I'm going to look at the origins of the Cold War today, and I'm going to look at how the home front was mobilized in order to make the Cold War as effective as it was on the home front. After World War II, there were two rival post-war powers. The United States emerged as the most powerful military and economic nation, and its goal was to lead the world in both democracy and economic cooperation, capitalist economic cooperation. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, emerged from World War II powerfully militarily, economically weaker, and also having suffered 20 million casualties in World War II. It had the most powerful army in Europe, and its goal was to set up a sphere of influence in East Europe to avoid any future German invasion. This is a map of Europe at the end of World War II. As you can see, the green nations on the left eventually form part of the NATO pact. The purple nations on the right, all communist run, all of them dominated by Russia. They form part of the Warsaw Pact. Germany itself is divided into 4 regions, and eventually a West Germany and an East Germany will emerge. Austria will eventually become an independent nation. So this tension between the US and the Soviet Union eventually boils over, because the Soviet Union, or Russia, I use them interchangeably, set up communist governments in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. This is contrary to their promises at the Yalta Conference to allow for free elections in Poland. The U.S. believed communism was driven to continuously expand, and it became committed to stopping any further aggression into Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union. In 1947, President Truman embraces what's known as the Containment Doctrine as part of his Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was put into effect in Greece and Turkey. Britain could no longer afford to support these nations in their struggle against communism, and both were in a strategic position between Europe and the Middle East. Communists threatened both, and so Truman got involved. He increasingly viewed the world as divided between the free world and the communist world. And part of the Cold War mission was America was going to lead and defend the free world. He proposed a bill which eventually would fund both Greece and Turkey's government in their military struggles against their domestic communist uprisings. This got broad congressional support. The Truman Doctrine would support anti-communist regimes globally, regardless of their democratic standing or not. It would forge alliances against the Soviet Union, and it would create new national security bodies in order to defend America's interests at home and overseas, all of which were free from domestic oversight, such as the Atomic Energy Commission, which developed future atomic weaponry, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Another part of the Truman Doctrine was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was meant to rebuild Europe through direct U.S. grants. The goal was to end the poverty that bred sympathy for communism, and its achievements were wide. By 1950, Western Europe surpassed all pre-war levels of production. It further divided the East from the West, especially since Stalin was refusing any funding for the nations under his control. In Japan, the U.S. also built the Japanese economy. And it made Japan a bastion of the Far East. It revived their technology, and Japan only had a modest military presence thereafter in Asia, pretty much under the protection of the U.S. atomic umbrella. Crisis between the East and the West continued with the Berlin Crisis. In June of 1948, the U.S. and the U.K. and France introduced a new currency in their 3 Western German zones of occupation. They were about to set up a new state, permanently separating it from East Berlin. and East Germany, Stalin, the leader of Russia, retaliates by setting up a blockade of West Berlin. West Berlin was deep in the heart of East Germany. In order to get to it, the Western powers had to drive through East Germany, which was Soviet-controlled. But this was now blockaded. So the West responded with an airlift flying over Russian troops in order to deliver food to their West Berlin territory. Stalin refused to shoot them down for fear of triggering World War III, and within a year he lifts the blockade. West Berlin is reunited with West Germany, and thereafter there was a formal separation between the two Germanys, a formal West Germany and a formal East Germany. The crisis escalated the following year, when in 1949 the Soviet Union showed that it had acquired the atomic bomb. This was followed by the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization by the Western powers against the Soviet Union and its nations. It was meant to respond to any Soviet aggression against any NATO members. Russia responded with the Warsaw Pact. These alliances are now shown on the map in front of you. This alliance, NATO, compelled America to defend its allies in a way that it hadn't since the beginning of its history. Things got further worse in 1949 when the communists took China. China had been engaged in a civil war for nearly 20 years now. In 1949, the communists were finally successful under the leadership of Mao Zedong. The political repercussions in the United States were vast. There was significant frustration at having quote-unquote lost China to communism. The Americans refused to recognize the Communist government of China as a legitimate government. Moreover, they drastically expanded military spending because now they saw the world as the world situation as a permanent struggle between the communist nations and the anti-communist nations. And in this map you see how the size of the Soviet Union and China, both communist nations, having fallen to communism, had frightened American governments into the belief that a third of the world was now under communist control. And what came next? What came next was Korea. The Korean War broke out in 1950. Korea had been divided after World War II between a communist North and an anti-communist South. The North Koreans wanted to reunite the country. In 1950, North Korea invades the South, shown on this map here, as well as the various counteroffensives. Truman steps in and convinces the United Nations to resist North Korean communist aggression. This is a successful campaign under General Douglas MacArthur, an American, who pushes North Korea back into their home territory, but then he pushes too far, pushing the forces of North Korea all the way to the Chinese border. And MacArthur was encouraging the use of nuclear weapons on China if they should intervene. The Chinese did in fact intervene, and in a massive counterattack pushed UN forces all the way back to the current dividing line between North and South Korea. This is where it is to this day. The Cold War raised many concerns amongst critics at home. Critics of the Truman Doctrine who saw the world, the Truman Doctrine, which saw the world as everything divided between communists and anti-communists, felt that U.S. foreign policy was being reduced to a simple East-West division, either with us or against us. This meant that the U.S. had to intervene in every single event to make sure the communists did not get any advances in those territories. This meant that the Americans were allying with undemocratic regimes just because they were anti-communist. It also meant that in a world where colonies were fighting for and getting their independence, the Americans were not initially supportive of colonial independence because they felt these new nations may turn to communism, and it was best that they stay under European control, European anti-communist control. Now, how did the Americans manage to keep the American people so committed to the to the global Cold War against communism and against the spread of communism at home. Many realms were mobilized. For instance, the arts. The arts were mobilized to attack communism as tyranny and to trumpet America as the defenders of liberty. In Hollywood, films were made that encouraged anti-communism, the defense of America as a patriot, as the defender of liberty. Paintings by the abstract expressionists such as Jackson Pollock were touted by the American government, specifically the CIA, as expressions of artistic freedom which you would not find in a communist nation. In music, the government sent jazz musicians worldwide to show how incredibly racially tolerant America was, and thus, in the great competition between capitalism and communism, democracy and communism, America should be chosen because it provided not only artistic freedom, but also it promoted its musicians, specifically African American musicians who were jazz musicians. Much of this use of culture involved the secret involvement of national security agencies. The CIA funded overseas art exhibits, music concerts, and publications. It highlighted America as a place of cultural freedom and advancement against the dictatorship of the Soviet Union and China. In political discourse, and here's a picture of Jackson Pollock's abstract expressionism. In political discourse, the Soviet Union was labeled a totalitarian state, with the government having total control. America was touted as the defender of liberty, and opposition grew to all government programs within the political discourse because they were now seen as socialist. For instance, socialized medicine, housing. This is how government funding for medicine or housing was now being talked about in the public sector, being accused of communism, and so cutting funding. The next lecture we cover the second half of this chapter, which deals with, for instance, the Truman presidency and its plight with returning soldiers from overseas, a labor onslaught against a labor strike, and increasing division within Congress against any New Deal-like policies.